what I found fascinating and quite challenging to myself that had changed my mindset was when you talk to people and say, what is your need from a security perspective? And they turn around and say, we don't know.
Today, the world is witnessing record-breaking numbers of aid worker deaths. In a global context complicated by protracted conflicts, climate change, and public health emergencies, we ask, what does security and safety of aid workers look like? And what might it look like in the future? I'm Christian Kritikos from GISF, the Global Interagency Security Forum. In each episode of our podcast, I'll be introducing a conversation on a key topic for NGO security, from the localization of aid to digital risks, and much more. Today's discussion focuses on a recent mission by GISF's Technical Security Risk Management Lead, Matt Stockton. Matt spent several weeks in Jordan and Lebanon during the Israel-Hezbollah conflict. During his time in the region, Matt was seconded to LIF, the Lebanon Humanitarian INGO Forum. Working closely with the forum, Matt helped to improve security coordination and training in the region to protect aid workers during a moment of heightened risk and uncertainty. Matt was also supported by ACF, Action Against Hunger, which hosted him during his time in Lebanon. Returning from his mission, Matt is now joined by GISF's research officer, Emily Wright, for a frank conversation on the successes and learnings from his time in the Middle East. I hope you enjoy the discussion.
Hi, Matt. Welcome back from Lebanon, and thanks for joining me today.
Emily, hello. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. Good to be home.
Welcome. So I wanted to start off by asking you about your role. So it's a new position for GISF and is taking us in a direction that we haven't explored before. So why did GISF decide to introduce this role? And what are you hoping to achieve in this position?
So GISF is at a really interesting stage of its life cycle as an NGO. And I think we are trying to innovate. I think we have a really strong basis. We've been around for a while now. I think the idea is just to build off that in a couple of different directions. And so part of my role is to make sure that the documents we're writing currently and the ones that we need to update are focused on the people who will be using them as an end user on the ground during crises, but also during the daily running of an NGO's day-to-day business and whatever environment they work in. So partly that's my role, to remind us that actual on-the-ground field coordinators and SRM focal points exist. And then part of it is to provide crisis deployment capability so I can go places. But the idea is to be there fast, be there quick, and to provide the support that the NGOs on the ground need, not necessarily in a very, very tightly formalized way, but be more flexible than that and more fluid. I hope that was one of the benefits of what we did in Lebanon, was that we could really adapt quite quickly to what the NGOs needed from us, rather than going in with a preconceived notion of this is how GISF thinks or how Matt thinks that we should be doing things.
Perfect. So can we build off of that and talk about why Lebanon was your first place for deployment?
So Lebanon was a bit of a weird one with Lebanon. So when I started, I came into the organization in May, I think. We had talked around the concept of what the deployed role would look like and how that would work in practice. And we had really thought there wouldn't be a crisis we would be able to deploy to kind of this year. We were looking at all the things that were going on, and there are a lot of people already helping in the larger crises. And it was really trying to figure out how, not just going for the sake of going somewhere, like picking any crisis that you could off the map, off a quick Google search, and then being like, we want to go there so that we can say we've been there. It was more a case of where do we think we can be appropriate. We kind of decided there wasn't anything going on at the moment that we could add as much value to as we'd like to without just getting in the way and confusing things. And so we decided on looking at a pre-crisis deployment. So going into a location and kind of assessing and building those relationships, just kind of letting people know what we were capable of doing, trying to figure out what their capabilities were. And if a crisis were to start there, they would understand us, we would understand them, and we could better fit in with their model. And Lebanon was the first place that we decided to that. It was whilst regional tensions were increasing, but nothing had actively happened at that point. It was also, at the time, incredibly permissive in terms of you could go there relatively easily. Flights to Beirut still operating, relatively straightforward. And it's a pretty permissive city to be in. It's very NGO friendly, I think, city to be in, very well established as a hub. And largely the NGOs working out of Lebanon are either helping some IDPs, but largely using it as a base for development in Syria. But it made sense to us within the region to do a pre-crisis deployment there. So as a result, there was also an element of this is the first crisis deployment, obviously, or pre-crisis deployment that GISF had ever done. So it's a bit about cutting our own teeth and making sure that we were doing things in the safest way for us, because the worst thing we could have done is throw me into a place like Gaza or Sudan without having the actual mechanisms tested in the field in a kind of safe and secure way. So whilst we were looking at pre-crisis deployment in Lebanon, we were building up relationships with the forum, making sure that we were really coordinating tightly with them. And then the attacks in September happened, or the pager explosions and the phones kind of blowing up started to happen. We then ran a roundtable for Lebanon. So we got our members in and kind of started discussing how things were on the ground in Lebanon. And we got Caitlin, who's the forum coordinator, and George, who's their access coordinator, who are both absolutely excellent individuals, just as people, but also incredibly good at their jobs. We got them in to talk to some of our members about the context. And in that conversation, it came up that they had a need for security coordination in the moment. And that's when we said, okay, perfect. This is an opportunity for us we'd already done some of the pre-work beforehand, just as a coincidence more than anything, but let's kind of put our money where our mouth is. And this is an opportunity. So that's how Lebanon was chosen. I guess it kind of fell into our lap.
So I know part of the time you were also in Jordan. So can you talk a little bit about the context in Jordan and then the context in Lebanon while you were deployed there?
We had to be kind of very self-aware about our limitations and what we could and couldn't do, and at the infancy of this deployment mechanism. And we decided that Amman was a good regional hub that I could still go and be in. Very, very permissive. So the situation in Jordan, kind of very stable. A lot of the global hubs are there. A lot of the kind of NGOs, if NGOs had moved people out of Beirut, it had often been to Amman. So there was a good hub of Lebanon NGO workers, headquarters, people who were really good, really useful conversations to have before I went in. And so we decided to go to Amman to get there and understand. There's also a reality of what happened when the crisis started happening in Beirut and Lebanon, where a lot of the security managers and a lot of the NGOs kind of scattered, kind of rightly so, to the four winds, following their own emergency procedures. So it wasn't that everyone was in Beirut. It was that a lot of people were in the mountains, or had moved north, or had moved to various places, and some NGOs had just completely evacuated, or had evacuated international staff, national staff, and the coordination mechanisms weren't really there for those individual organizations. So there was also a balance between where is the value that can be added. So a whole host of things. Yeah, the infancy of our response and making sure we had the mechanisms and security procedures in place. We needed to be hosted because it's just me. And GISF, I think, has quite a big footprint compared to its actual staff footprint. We project outward quite large compared to our actual kind of physical presence. But I still needed someone to host me. So I needed an agency, an NGO, and ACF were incredibly kind, incredibly gracious, and they were excellent in agreeing to host me. But then we did agreeing, and we needed to kind of get our eye on the context and situation, fully understand what it looked like on the ground. And when you're holding various meetings, coordination meetings and coordination hubs remotely, where's the value in having them, trying to balance out value of, is it better to hold them in person where only a couple of people are there, or hold remote ones where everybody's there, and kind of that balance with also not wanting to just send people into a war zone for the sake of being in a war zone. What we really want to try and avoid this entire time is presentationalism, or just like planting a flag for the sake of being able to say, here we are. So actually we were fully prepared to be in Amman for the entire thing. Now, knowing what I know now, I think there was an enormous amount of value into getting to Beirut. I respect the decision-making process, and I would make the same decisions again with the same knowledge of actually, let's hold back. Let's just make sure we're doing things in a sensible, kind of measured way. But yeah, so so Amman was very stable. Lots of people coming in from Beirut that were useful to talk to. And then Beirut itself, or Lebanon itself, was under significant bombardment from the Israeli Defense Force. Both south of the Litani was the main target, looking at Hezbollah targets, strongholds, but also lots of villages or high point strategic points were being struck with quite heavy munitions. So you saw massive internal person displacement in Beirut, and you'll get an argument maybe from people listening to this about whether Dahiyeh, which is a suburb, which is either counted as a suburb of Beirut or part of Mount Lebanon district, but is just an area just south of Beirut, or really within the suburbs, was getting struck relatively regularly. And that seems the Hezbollah stronghold within that kind of area. And then areas in central Beirut itself were being struck, but very specifically depending on Israeli targeting, and you can kind of see the spread of different kinds of munitions which were being used in terms of the size and the level of precision kind of went up and down. So that's what was going on in Beirut. And so I was in Amman for 4 weeks, and then I was in Beirut for kind of 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks.
Perfect. Can you talk a little bit about the context for local NGOs in Lebanon? I know a lot of them were more focused on development. And so how was the switch going over to humanitarian work, and what did you see happening in this space?
Like I said previously, because Lebanon had been, relatively speaking, from an NGO operational point of view, stable for a while, a lot of NGOs were using Lebanon as a base to conduct development activity or NGO work across the region, but largely into Syria. And or you were working on some kind of more local kind of projects in and around Lebanon, but there wasn't a crisis need. There wasn't a persistent crisis need like we see in other responses. And so when the initial attacks went in, a lot of those NGOs had to pivot from development mindset into crisis mindset. Now that's all well and good if you are a very well-funded, very kind of established NGO. But if you have limited resources, if you're working in a slightly more niche environment, or if you're firmly focused on development or something which isn't aligned with crisis, so you might not have a security focal point. You might not, the security focal point might be your HR manager, your logs manager, your country director might also be doing that function. And that's fine to a point within relative peacetime, or when you're doing routine business and you're not dealing with things exploding a lot, or suddenly the areas you're working in becoming incredibly unsafe. But when that happens, your work then multiplies tenfold, as well as if you are an INGO, you've got a global headquarters turning around and demanding things from you. There might be a donor demanding things from you to make sure things are safe. And if you are lucky, you have had a basic level of SRM kind of training. Or if you're lucky, you have an actual security manager. But if you're one of those smaller NGOs, you really are you can feel very left on your own. And I think that's one of the benefits of an organization like LIF and the forum itself, is that it really helps turn around and just be like, you guys aren't on your own, but there was a point of contact already established where we could then reach in and say, what do you need? And then provide kind of the resources or kind of mentoring or whatever it was to try and kind of upskill. But it was a huge level of, and within LIF, you've got 69 organizations at the start, I think now 72. And there's a huge spectrum of range and ability there, and willingness or ability to absorb crisis and absorb risk, and willingness to take risk on. Some organizations pivot very quickly and say, yes, we want to be working in Dahlia still. We want to be doing this. We want to be really on the forefront of things. And they have the resources to absorb that, but a lot don't. And that was a big shock for, I think, a lot of organizations as the context shifted.
So then can you build off of that and tell me more about the in-person training that you were doing with these NGOs and what that looked like?
Yeah, so we did a bunch of in-person training, two main different kinds of focus for our capacity building. One was a general security risk management basics. And that was for kind of all staff, not just people with kind of management responsibilities, but basically to say, this is what a security setup looks like. What a security plan is, risk assessment. These are the basics you need to be thinking about from personal security. And this is how kind of you implement things in the field. It was a short session, but I think quite valuable. And actually a lot more valuable than I had initially anticipated, mainly because I had gone in with an assumption, and it's definitely a very strong learning point for GISF, I think, which was because I've kind of worked in the SRM sector for a while now, I had naively approached the task as if everybody had at least a base level of knowledge or understanding. What I found fascinating and quite challenging to myself that had shifted my mindset was when you talk to people and say, what is your need from a security perspective? And they turn around and say, we don't know, because they don't have an understanding of what's available, what they should have, what can be done, what resources are out there, what's not going to cost them money. And a lot of people are just unsure, sometimes scared. So that kind of initial training is effectively teaching people the basics. So your average everyday individual with just personal security risk, let's say HR managers, finance managers, people who aren't being involved in big security decisions, just understand the words that people are using when they're talking about risk assessments. Because all of those functions, as much as sometimes they choose not to believe so, or security tends to try and cut them out, all of those functions do feed into the security decisions, and they all have places to play. So it's important when someone says, I need this information because I'm going to include it in the security plan. They understand what a security plan is and how that's written. So that training was really useful. We did that with a couple of organizations. We did largely mixed sessions, so lots of different organizations in the same classroom together and going over things and kind of making sure that we had time to break out and go, we had time to focus on the specific needs of the group. And then we did another kind of session, which was a one-on-one session. which was really, really useful for me, at least, to understand the context. But I'm really hoping we're doing the evaluation of the study now, so I can't tell you if it was useful or not, but we will publish that to our members, no doubt. And that was sitting down with NGO security managers from any NGO that wanted it for a couple of hours at a time and going over specifics about their needs. So that could be education on how to do a risk assessment. What does a risk assessment look like? Here are templates, and walking through some GISF resources that we've got and all of the kind of signposting that we do with that. Or it could be, okay, here's a document that they had written, be it a movement order, be it something else. Let's go over that. They're unsure about it, or they want some kind of review. Let's go over it. And the importance is providing, and I'm going to use some kind of quite non-SRM language, but quite in vogue language. So some people hopefully will roll their eyes or kind of applaud in equal measure, but providing a bit of a safe space where individuals can turn around and say, I don't know what I'm doing. And providing somebody outside the kind of the chain of management to allow people just to turn around and say, I need help in this area, and something that can allow them to be a bit vulnerable, dare I say, or just ask questions that they might not want to ask people who write their reports or who, they rely on for their promotions or wages or whatever else. And so I think that was a very useful function. And yeah, it largely looked like walking people through how security plans are written, the difference between security plan and a risk assessment, the pitfalls that people fall into, as well as here are a bunch of things which already exist, which are free. And this is where you find them. Do not spend hours and hours of your very, very precious time, which again, largely split between other operations, logistics, HR, everything else, writing the stuff which already exists and making sure they understood how to use it, and providing kind of, a safe space, a point of contact where they could reach back to as well and say, do you know where I can get a risk assessment? Or do you know anyone who's done a risk assessment for this particular area? So there's another function of that where you can share information, and organizations are sharing information all the time, which is fantastic, but some don't want to. And GISF and that kind of role that I provided can be a bit of a neutral medium, impartial advisor, where someone can come to me and say, I'm really struggling to put together a risk assessment for, let's say, Baalbek, given, name an area. Do you have one? And if I don't have one accessed immediately, which I don't, I'm not a Lebanon context expert, I'm not someone who's worked there for a long period of time, I can then anonymize the request, push it out to the SRM focal points and just say, I've had a request for this piece of information. Can you, anyone who's got anything, and some people would send some things back. And again, you would anonymize it and send on the information. So that training as well, like the training we did there, was also to teach people a little bit how to do that kind of coordination, what to expect, what not to expect, but just generally basically tell people that they weren't on their own, which is, I think, so often very valuable in that kind of situation.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And you've kind of alluded to this, but can you talk about some of the challenges and lessons learned from this deployment?
I think a lot of the challenges were, as I said before, this is the first time we did it. It's the first time that we were kind of building the ship as we were making it. Now, that gave us an enormous amount of flexibility, which was incredible, to be able to turn up and just say, look, here's our agreed terms of reference and what roughly you want me to do, but is there anything else you want me to do as well? And have the latitude within the role to be able to do that. And a learned lesson is definitely that needs to be retained. And that is definitely the model I think we're going to go forward with, which is we need to be flexible to the needs of the organization we are supporting and we are serving. There's no point in turning up and saying, this is a GISF way of doing things. It's just, I think it's been a very successful, from that perspective of being responsive to the needs of the organization. So it could be that I'd have been like, okay, here's this one-on-one training that I think would be useful for you guys. Anyone want it? They turn around and say, no, but we do want training on UXOs, or we want training on something else. And then I can go and source it and I can go and run those things down and then bring it back. And there's a whole host of that flexibility, which was such, I think, very powerful in the context. There are also things which I think we need to tighten up. There are good lessons learned from the hosting arrangement, where actually we now have kind of template hosting arrangements, which we didn't have before. And ACF were incredible all the way through. They were absolutely amazing, both with their patience to us as well as the actual hosting. And so we learned a load of lessons there about how to do things right. And so we're taking a lot of templates forward from that and kind of what to expect, what not to expect, which is really, really positive. And I think in general communication, I think it was a really interesting one where I was talking to a lot of the security focal points, very privileged to have that access, and talking about the resources that we have available. And we can see it in our data where we see direct correlation after the large talks I did with kind of 60, 70 plus SRM focal points, talking about the templates, talking about the toolkit that's on our website talking about the different language resources that we have, you can see spikes in access. And so again, I think it validates very useful for me, validates my job existing in total, which is we have really good name recognition at the strategic level, but I don't often think it makes it all the way down to the field operational side of things. And so definitely have come home with a focus on not just more resources, but maybe more resources at the global level to allow people to push this down to operational level, if that makes any sense. So effectively, there are some ideas in motion, which would be us providing a facility regularly a month where people can just send their country security focal points, country directors, where I can walk them through, or someone like me can walk them through what resources are available, so that we're not relying on people learning about that in crisis, but just understanding that maybe we don't have a good name recognition on the ground as we should do, as we could have. And the advantage of that is that we don't have to write all the resources because they're already there already, and they are good resources that I've used in the field in many jobs before this already, or I kind of moved into the organization. It's just letting people know they're there. And I guess this is what part of this podcast is about, this kind of signaling to anybody that even if I'm assuming that maybe the people who are listening to this might already be at the global level or quite a senior level within their organizations, and that's great. And it's wonderful that they're engaging with this material, but it also needs to be engaged with at the kind of absolute coalface. And that was kind of eye-opening as well to see how far our reach was and the level that we need to put work in to make sure it goes further.
So continuing on that same idea and rounding out our conversation, what do you see as what's coming next for your role?
A number of more deployments are planned. Now, with crisis deployments, we can't kind of plan them ahead of time. I wish we could. I wish we had a crystal ball that we could see what was going to happen. We don't. We just have to be ready for that. But what we are doing is planning a number of pre-crisis deployments to areas that are where the risk is either increasing or that we think there is a fair chance of a need for a crisis deployment in the next year, couple of years, something like that. So going out to link in with the coordination mechanisms and making sure that people on the ground have an understanding of the resources that we have and what we can offer, and trying to get ahead of the game in terms of what they might need from us and what shape our deployment and support of them would look like if we went in. So a number of, there's 4 or 5 of those planned. There's a number of capacity building workshops at the same time, which are linked in with those. And again, if you're an organization out there who wants some security capacity building, coordination capacity building, give us a shout, because there's money for that we have kind of already locked in. So we just need people to want to be taught. And I think just generally, everybody in GISF is going to get bored of me constantly reminding people that we need to be focused on the operations side of things and on that kind of end user. So that's kind of my personal goal for the next stages of this role and how it looks in the future, is being a real advocate for them and having as much contact with them as time. And also using that not just to kind of bully the regional and global security focal points, but with an explicit intention of taking work off their hands and making their jobs easier. So it will be definitely done in coordination as a kind of holistic kind of model of how we get the right resources in the right place for the right people at the right time. And if I can achieve half of that, I'll be very happy, man.
Well, that sounds good. And thanks for joining me today. It was a great talking to you, getting some more insight on your trip to Lebanon, and we'll talk again soon.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Emily. Catch you later.
You've been listening to a podcast by GISF, the Global Interagency Security Forum. We're a member-led organization with a worldwide network of over 130 members and associates. We're committed to ensuring NGOs can sustainably access people in need through improved safety and security for their aid workers and operations. Today's episode of the GISF podcast featured Matt Stockton and Emily Wright. If you're interested in hearing more about the topics raised in Matt and Emily's conversation, please check out the GISF website at gisf.ngo. There you will find hundreds of resources, including our new glossary. Matt spoke about the importance of having a common terminology when talking about risk management, and GISF's glossary provides just this. It collects over 200 security risk management terms and definitions in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic to support more accurate communication across language barriers. Just search GISF Glossary to find this resource. I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of the GISF podcast. You can keep up with all the latest episodes by subscribing to our show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, or by following GISF's YouTube channel. This episode of the podcast was introduced by me, Christian Kritikos. It was produced by Charlie Gafella and Talani Ubi Mohideen. The music was provided by Moby, courtesy of mobygratis.com. I hope you can join us again next time.